insights into sort of addressing different populations and settings with different thematic focuses. So I'm going to hand it over to Wayne to introduce the speakers.
Great. And before I do that, I just wanted to note one thing about our first panelist. My understanding that at the end of this month, Laura is retiring. So thought it would be a good idea to thank her for all her contributions and congratulate her on reaching this important milestone in life. So with that, let me go to introducing the speakers. As Sherry said at the beginning of this, we're sort of plowing through with without a formalized break in here, but obviously if you need to take one, just turn your camera off, put your mic on mute and take the break that you need to break, and we'll proceed on. So in this particular panel, we're gonna have three speakers again. And our first speaker is going to be Dr. Keith Horvath, who's an associate professor of clinical psychology at San Diego State University. And his research focuses primarily on developing and testing HIV prevention and treatment mHealth interventions for sexual and gender minorities. And this work includes studies to develop and test mHealth and technology-based interventions to optimize on-demand PrEP strategies. And Dr. Horvath will be focusing his particular remarks today on adaptation considerations for digital interventions. And then our second speaker is going to be Dr. Ruben Paracadona, who is both an associate professor in the Steve Hicks School of Social Work and the director of research at the Latino Research Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. And his research is focused on cultural adaptation of prevention-related parenting interventions for low-income Latina and Latino immigrant communities. And he's going to be speaking on the topic of integrating culture, science, and advocacy, cultural adaptation, and prevention research. And then the third speaker in the panel will be Dr. Susan Kegeles, who's a professor of medicine here in the Division of Prevention Science at UCSF. And she brings considerable experience designing and implementing HIV prevention interventions for diverse groups, including men who have sex with men, transgender women, and injection drug users. Her empowerment project, which was initially developed for use here in the US, has been disseminated and implemented by over 175 community-based organizations across the country. And it's also been implemented internationally. And Dr. Kegeles' focus this morning is in fact going to be on adapting empowerment to two of those international contexts. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Horvath.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks, Wayne, for the invitation and Sherry for the invitation. It's exciting to be here today. And I actually just got promoted to full professor, which I'm very excited about. So, but that's not until August, so I can't.
Well, then let me extend a congratulations to you for that milestone as well.
It's been a long time coming, so I'm happy to be at that point. Okay, let me go ahead and share. Can everybody see this? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So, again, thanks for allowing me to share my thoughts today on issues related to adaptation and the implementation of digital interventions. I have no conflicts to declare. Okay. So when we think of digital interventions, one of the first things that we sort of need to sort out is what kind of adaptations are we really attempting? So listed on this slide are a few ways that adaptation can actually occur. So you can adapt an existing face-to-face intervention to a digital platform. Alternatively, you might be able to adapt an intervention that was previously in one form of technology and adapt it to an intervention into another form of technology. For example, you could adapt a telephone-based intervention into a text messaging or SMS intervention. A third form of adaptation is taking an intervention really primarily for one population that's in some form of digital format and then adapting it into a new intervention for a different population. And then this would still, of course, require modifying the contents and the features and potentially the look and the feel of the intervention to be community appropriate. And then finally, another form of adaptation is taking a face-to-face intervention and adding digital components to it. So for example, you could take a face-to-face group-based intervention and add on a digital component where group members could communicate with each other between meetings. Again, this is certainly not an exhaustive list, and it's just a few ideas about how that adaptation may occur, but it's really important to kind of understand what you're adapting. So as you know from the really wonderful talks you've heard today, the adapted model is a common process for adapting interventions in our field and includes the 8 phases that you see here on this screen. So for the remainder of my talk, I wanted to walk through each of the phases of this model and talk about important considerations related to digital interventions. And listening to the other talks, it really struck me that a lot of the questions and the sort of nuances will also sort of play out when we talk about digital interventions. So the first phase of the adapted model is the assessment phase, where focus groups or a needs assessment is conducted with that new group in order to understand their particular risks or vulnerabilities. So in terms of thinking about digital interventions, device ownership and technology adoption and proficiency are important considerations. So for example, youth who have very high levels of smartphone ownership and proficiency may have really a different reception to a digital intervention than community members who perhaps are older and perhaps live in more rural areas. But I think we have to be really careful not to assume that some communities have lower device adoption and proficiency. So we know from statistics from the Pew Research Center that people who are Black or African American have higher mobile phone and smartphone adoption than people from other races and ethnicities. So overall, it's really critical to understand, how the new community of interest really uses technology as either a facilitator or a challenge to delivering your digital intervention. And this should be asked in this phase in addition to the sort of usual questions in focus groups or during a needs assessment. Now, with respect to key stakeholders, we clearly need more information about how to integrate digital interventions into existing organizational infrastructure, but I'll talk more about this later on in the talk. As in a good example of conducting focus groups to better understand technology adoption and perceptions around digital interventions, we published a paper in which we summarize use preferences for digital interventions across 5 adolescent trials and network studies. And the majority of these studies were with sexual minority males, with a focus on PrEP uptake and or adherence. However, Youth Thrive involved youth living with HIV, and TechStep was for HIV negative, transgender, and gender diverse youth. So on the next couple of slides are the primary findings across these studies. An important feature of digital interventions for youth is that they have strong security and privacy protections, and that's primarily in the service of avoiding stigma. Youth wanted multiple privacy protections, such as passwords. They did not feel particularly comfortable logging in through commercial platforms such as Facebook or Twitter. And all of these protections were framed around reducing potential stigma related to HIV status, sexual orientation, or sexual behavior. Youth were also understandably concerned that digital interventions reflect their diversity and their unique identities. So this may be using imagery that they felt was familiar and represented them, focusing on positive and motivational framing during content development, and infusing the intervention with humor. Youth also told us that they appreciated opportunities to engage with digital interventions in multiple ways, and that they liked the look and the feel of familiar platforms such as Snapchat, Instagram, and Facebook. I think this was before the rise of TikTok. Some of the suggestions that youth had for engagement included gamification, messaging functions, and connecting with staff or clinicians through the platform. Finally, many youth wanted more expansive content that included positive role models. Specifically, youth living with HIV wanted a focus on holistic health rather than solely focusing on managing HIV. So taken together, these findings from focus groups shed light on not only what are some of the important features of digital interventions that should be included, such as passwords or other protection features, but also on the type of imagery and the approach that should be taken to optimize engagement with digital interventions. So the next phase of the adaptive model is the decision phase that consists of reviewing evidence-based interventions and deciding whether to adopt it or adapt it. Most of the decisions will be made, for many of us who write grant proposals, these decisions will be made during the grant proposal writing process. However, an important consideration for digital interventions is that you may be adapting an intervention that has a relatively small evidence base. In other words, they may not be an EVI, which we talked just in this past panel. There are numerous systematic reviews of digital interventions that almost always conclude that there are few large-scale efficacy trials of digital interventions, and that most of the evidence comes from smaller pilot studies. Now, it's also important to understand why you want to adapt an existing intervention into a digital format. Digital interventions have a number of unique benefits that many of us know. For example, they have a potential wide reach, their ability to reach stigmatized groups, and their ease and convenience. In addition, I'd also say that there are communities who, for a variety of reasons, sort of expect interventions to be delivered in a digital format. So for example, youth do much of their socializing and get a lot of their health information online, and sort of expect then that those services be adapted for their smartphones. A third step of the adapted model is administration, where theater testing of the intervention is conducted to gain firsthand feedback from the community for the intervention. So theater testing with digital interventions may be a bit more challenging, since the intervention will likely not be built at this point in a way that you can sort of present the full intervention. However, it's possible to show relatively static mock-ups of the potential intervention interfaces to participants to gain their feedback. Also, if you have a working intervention that your team has already built for a different population or a different health outcome, you can show the new community this older intervention and gain feedback to inform adaptation. And just as we talked about in the last panel, you often get conflicting feedback from participants about the timing, frequency, and duration of intervention content, as well as on images and sort of the overall look and feel of the intervention. Because interventions are hard-coded, or digital interventions are often hard-coded, at some point the team will need to make some difficult choices about what the final features and what the final look and feel of the intervention really will be. And changing your mind later on in the development process comes at a pretty high financial cost and an important loss of time. Okay, so the fourth phase of the adaptive model is a production phase, where we typically draft of the intervention is fully developed, as well as a quality assurance plan. Developing a complete first draft of the intervention may take a number of months, more so than you may sort of encounter in traditional face-to-face interventions. And that's really because of the process that we use for building digital interventions. So to illustrate, on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see two types of development processes for digital interventions: the waterfall approach and the agile approach. So originally, when digital interventions were emerging, companies used what we call a waterfall method, where investigators would go to our development partners and basically tell them, hey, these are the requirements of the intervention, this is what we want to build. And then the company would sort of go away after a few months and build the whole intervention and think that they knew what they were building, and then present it very proudly to the investigator team. And what would happen is that the investigator team would often realize that what they had envisioned that intervention to be was not what was actually built. And so we really needed a new development process, and that's what we call sort of this agile approach. It goes by a lot of different names, but today we'll talk about it as the agile approach, where the process begins with usually choosing the part of the intervention that is the most challenging, and then building parts of it, going back to the investigator team, getting feedback on that, or the community advisory board getting feedback on that, until you sort of reach a satisfactory level of build on that part of the intervention that sort of is consistent with what we had envisioned. And then you move on to the next phase or next part of the intervention and build that part, and so forth. So what this means is, with the agile approach, you can really respond to problems that arise early in the development process, but also you can really make sure that the intervention is sort of being built as it's envisioned. Now, the downside is that, of course, that a first full draft of the intervention really may not be ready until much later than you'd like it to. And so that sometimes doesn't fit really neatly within this framework. Okay, the adaptation model also includes, as we know, a topic expert advice phase. And so, as we mentioned before, topic experts often sort of historically were considered those persons with scientific expertise and often within academic settings. Certainly there is recognition that we've heard about even in the last panel, that expertise can not only be derived from sort of people with lots of letters behind their names, but also need to include a range of voices if we want our digital interventions to be community appropriate. So as you can see here, I've included under topic experts, community advisory board members who are critical for providing guidance on content and feature choice. And then specific to digital interventions, we often have user experience experts, or what we call UX designers, who can provide much needed guidance on best practices for interface development that can really help to optimize engagement. In addition, digital interventions will require programming experts who actually will go out and build the program. Okay, the next phase, in the integration phase, the model proposes to bring together the first draft of intervention and topic expertise to kind of complete the production process. As mentioned before, the process of production in digital interventions can be a bit protracted compared to traditional services or interventions. However, it's still possible to think of ways to integrate voices from experts, the community, and the development team. So on the right-hand side, you see a development process that our team proposed in one of our new mHealth studies, in which we begin the community advisory board meetings. We begin with community advisory board meetings represented by these orange boxes. After those CAB meetings, we will then hold focus groups shown in the blue boxes where we ask participants for feedback on different aspects of the intervention. And then we take what we've learned from the community advisory board meeting and the focus groups, and we take it back to the development team and the scientific expert team to discuss how to build different pieces of that intervention. And so this process will really continue eventually until we're ready to do usability testing and prepare it for the RCT. Okay, with respect to training for digital interventions, there are some aspects that are similar to traditional face-to-face interventions. Obviously, if human interaction is required, staff who are conducting the intervention will need to know and understand the components of the intervention and how to deliver those components. However, digital interventions may not actually require human interaction, but staff will still need to onboard participants to the intervention during the enrollment visit. And by onboarding, I mean educating participants on the different intervention components, how to access those components, and then who to contact if they run into problems. And the onboarding process is really also an important time to really set expectations for the intervention. For example, if the intervention is meant to be used weekly, then that should be conveyed to participants during this onboarding process so participants know how best to engage with the intervention. Training will also need to involve how to monitor participant engagement during the actual trial and identify any technical problems that could arise and address those quickly. In addition, the team may have developed electronic fidelity tools such as electronic navigator notes that staff will need to be trained on as appropriate. Okay, and finally we get to the last phase of the model, which is the testing phase, in which we pilot test the new digital intervention or do a larger RCT or an implementation study. And data sources in digital interventions, of course, include both traditional survey sources and then objective measures like DBS for PrEP adherence or viral load information. But they also include data, which we often call paradata, on how the intervention was actually used during the trial period. So it's important for your team to discuss with your development partners, what kind of reports you want the intervention to use once data collection is complete. There are free data analytic programs to assess engagement with websites and mobile apps. However, teams usually come to the conclusion that they really need customized reports given the unique needs of research studies. And then during the testing phase, engagement with digital interventions is still a pretty significant barrier to optimize effects of these types of interventions. So you'll need to work with your development team to create processes where you can sort of like check in with participants regularly on how things are going and to really identify any technical issues that might be arising. And finally, just a note, remote or visual study processes, and I think many of you have found this out during COVID. Remote and virtual study processes are different, not necessarily easier than traditional face-to-face processes. And so the same amount of investment in time and energy to develop and train staff on these types of processes for digital interventions should be as intense as we would do with any other setting. Okay, so far I've been talking about adaptation and digital interventions. However, I just wanted to end with a bit of discussion around implementation of digital interventions. So when we think of implementation, there are essentially three ways that digital interventions may be implemented. And the first one is that digital interventions might be fully integrated into a clinic or organizational services. So for example, a digital intervention that integrates with electronic health records at a particular clinic or organization that offers a more tailored experience around adherence reminders or access to prevention services might be this sort of integration. Second, an organization may adopt a brick and click approach where the digital intervention is not super highly integrated into the services. Rather, clients or patients are referred to standalone digital interventions or services that the clinic is really sort of partnering with. So sexual minority men who begin PrEP, for example, might be referred to a mobile app or some other service that is specifically designed to promote adherence that the organization or clinic is partnering with. And then finally, there is a direct to consumer approach where digital interventions may not be linked to a clinic or organization at all. Rather, they may be published directly to the iOS or Google Play Store where people can directly find them and download the intervention to support their needs. All right, so as you know from the earlier talks, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CFIR, provides guidance from which to determine what sorts of questions should be asked to better understand how to implement the digital intervention. So here you see the 5 CFIR domains, including intervention characteristics, outer setting, inner setting, characteristics of the individuals, and processes. I just want to make it clear that the list of questions on here is certainly not exhaustive within each one of those domains. But in the intervention characteristics domain, we might ask, how do mHealth interventions compare to similar programs, and what evidence is needed to convince management or staff to adopt the intervention? For the outer setting, we can ask what technology barriers of clients will need to be addressed to optimize the implementation, and what sorts of funding will we need to implement it within that clinic. For the inner setting, is the culture really ready to adopt the intervention, and what resources are needed to adopt interventions within the clinic or organization? For characteristics of individuals, how knowledgeable are staff about digital interventions? That can be really sort of confusing for folks. And then, not only how knowledgeable are they, but also how confident are they that they can implement the intervention within their setting. And then finally, with respect to process, we should ask ourselves who the key decision makers are and who will need to sign off on those interventions used in that setting, as well as understanding, how can we really implement that digital intervention as we had planned. So with that, I think I am a bit over time, so I'll end there, and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. So Dr. Horvath's talk was focused on adaptation in a digital sphere, and we are going to go over to Dr. Padacardona, who is going to be talking about cultural adaptation. So I will hand it over.
Hello, can you see me and hear me well?
I can see you and I can hear you.
Perfect. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much again for this invitation. I'm very excited whenever I have the opportunity to talk about this topics that are so close to our hearts and that make meaning to what we do every day. Also, congratulations on that promotion to full professor. I'm in the midst of preparing the dossier, and oh my gosh, I'm feeling the pain. So congratulations on that huge milestone in your career. It's very inspiring. So yes, today I'm going to talk about cultural adaptation. So a little bit of background. We've been funded by NIMH and NIDA to conduct a long-term program of research on cultural adaptation for 15 years. So I come from the world of cultural adaptation to the world of implementation science. So I would like to express that feedback, because when I got into the field of implementation science, I was confused in terms of how people were talking about adaptation. Sometimes they were talking about adaptation more from the implementation science lens, and I was not sure if they were talking about cultural adaptation in the way I understood cultural adaptation. So the focus of my presentation is going to be on a cultural adaptation researcher or parenting prevention interventions moving into the field of implementation science. So now I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you should see my PowerPoint. Can you see my PowerPoint?
In all your slides. So
perfect.
To prevent, yeah, present. There you go.
There you go. Okay, now you see the presentation mode, right?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Great. Okay, so as I mentioned to you, this has been a journey of 15 years. I'm an immigrant. It took me 15 years to become a US citizen because of the very oppressive immigration system. So I don't come to cultural adaptation believing in cultural adaptation in the beginning. I was very angry towards the US immigration system. I was very scared of becoming an imperialistic with my research. But I came to the United States because I knew here I had the best opportunities for my career. And it has been a journey of reconciling with cultural adaptation, and now being a very strong advocate of cultural adaptation. So it's very important for you to know that background. I'm also a person who's speaking for a large community of people who have been committed throughout the years to this work. Is first and foremost the parents who have been in our interventions, community leaders, interventionists, project managers. It's been a very large community, and I want to thank and acknowledge every one of them. In our work, we have always tried to integrate a balance between social justice, science, and cultural relevance. And sometimes we progress on the rigor of the science, but then we overlook the social justice component. And then we need to recover also on the cultural relevance. So it's a very delicate balance in terms of achieving all those goals. Our work is with Latinx, Latino, Latina, and I can get into issues about why I use the terms in different ways, Latinx, Latino, Latina in the Q&A. But we work with Latino immigrant populations, first generation. Why? It's a personal issue. I'm an immigrant myself, now a US citizen with all the privileges that entail, but also because Latino immigrants provide so much for this country. So we see them everywhere. We see them in construction. We see them in the fields. We see them in the production of food for us. But it's a very invisible population that provides so much to this country, and unfortunately has been abused throughout the history of the United States. And many times, whenever the political and narratives are necessary in certain directions, they have become the scapegoats. But only when you become close to the reality of Latino immigrants, you fully understand the huge contributions, but also the tremendous adversity that they face in this country. So in many ways, this population is invisible, provides so much to the United States, but is invisible. They pay taxes, but they don't get benefits. So when I came into the world of implementation science, so many of the frameworks were operating on premises that you have the right to access services through welfare programs, the programs like Medicaid or insurance-based. Well, the population we work with is mostly uninsured. So it was very difficult I found great value on the implementation science frameworks when I first started in the field, but I also experienced very important barriers in terms of, okay, for our people, we cannot operate on basic premises. Like, for example, if they don't have insurance, how do we make our intervention sustainable? And that's when I got into the field of prevention. That's when I got into the field of prevention in terms of we need to offer something very important to our Latino families. They are offering so much. And for many years, I was a clinician in the juvenile justice system. And I saw firsthand the challenges when children didn't have the opportunity to be exposed to evidence-based parenting intervention, to evidence-based knowledge on caregiving. And I was very committed to offering a contribution in the realm of prevention and parenting, because when you have good parenting experiences, you prevent so many issues down the road in terms of development. I was very fortunate to come across extraordinary parenting researchers, Maren Forgach and Gerald Patterson, in the amazing work of the group Generation PMTO, that for 10 years, they developed observational research to develop evidence-based parenting interventions. So these are interventions that are very solid. And currently we collaborate with people across the world, University of Oxford, South Africa, the Philippines, in terms of parenting research. What are the cross-cultural components in parenting interventions that are relevant? But the focus of our intervention and adaptations has been the intervention known as Generation PMTO. Now, why cultural adaptation? When I was doing my clinical internship as a family therapist in training, I was subpoenaed to testify in about 20 trials. In the 19 trials where I represented ethnic minorities, they received very harsh sentences. And because we had public defendants who did not help me in the cross-examination. In the only one case where I represented a non-Latino white adolescent that was able to afford a private attorney, it was a much more benign decision that the judge arrived to, and it was just probation compared to imprisonment, like I have experienced with ethnic minority adolescents. So at that moment, I said, wow, the racism entrenched in the justice system back in the early 2000s when I experienced that is so intense that we need to offer families an alternative to not get engaged in the justice system at all. Now, with regards to cultural adaptation, there are many approaches to it. Our journey, our vision to it is that it's a process, but also it's very important that you follow a model and a theory and a framework to cultural adaptation, as well as the theory of the intervention itself. So regarding the process, and other presenters have presented about the importance of engaging in this process of learning from communities. Before we got engaged into any adaptations of the intervention of the original intervention Generation PMTO, which was originally tested with a majority of Euro-American populations, we engaged in a 2-year process to understand the life experiences of Latinos in Detroit. At that point, I was affiliated with the Michigan State University. So all my work was with the Latino immigrant population in Detroit. So we got embedded in this process of qualitative study with 83 parents to understand life experiences, but also the feasibility of doing parenting groups in that community. The major findings we had from that large study was we truly understand the experiences of adversity and discrimination, also understood the parenting challenges and the parenting needs. And this knowledge is extremely important in cultural adaptation, because when you go to the original intervention and you see the core components, you need to start inserting the components of adaptation in a way that makes sense to the population. But you cannot assume that you understand that reality. You need to let communities, parents, and families guide you in the understanding of that reality. For example, when we asked this father the question, what is like to experience discrimination as an undocumented father? He said, discrimination is a bitter drink that you need to swallow. You have to swallow it because you say, if I get rebellious or do not behave, they can throw me into jail or they won't help me. So you just have to swallow that drink. So this is extremely important. And let me emphasize, it's extremely important because when we are confronted with privilege, one of our initial reactions is to get rid of that difficult feeling that we have of being faced with the privilege that we carry. So for these families, it's not about that things are gonna get better. For these families, they always think that they can be deported. They are working hard, they're contributing so much, but they don't see an avenue to become undocumented. So that's why this father is saying discrimination, you just have to swallow it. It's not gonna get better. I cannot fight back. So if you are delivering a group and you say, oh, let's work on assertiveness, and how is it that you can challenge those realities? But if that father is undocumented, you can become very iatrogenic in your interventions if you don't understand in which context you can do advocacy. Now, we offer advocacy alongside our parenting intervention, but we're very careful about that advocacy in a way that will not be detrimental to families. And it's a very delicate work in which we need to design those advocacy-focused interventions. Now, the other piece of these informative phases, of qualitative phases, is that they give you the strengths of that community. And, you know, I'm just in awe, for example, in the summers here in Austin at 100 degrees, 105 degrees, we just replaced our roof, right? So the contractors were all non-Latino whites. They negotiated everything. And I told my wife, okay, wait for the crew. It's going to be all Latinos. And just as I expected, all Latinos. It's 108 degrees, right? And they're in the roof. They're singing, they're laughing, they're celebrating because they're grateful to have a job and they're grateful to provide for their families. That's a perfect example of the resilience of the Latino immigrant populations. Just like this mother expressed, Latino values is to instill in your children to be respectful of others. It goes in the blood what your parents teach you. Now, this is the differential cultural adaptation trial funded by NIMH. This was our first study in which we compare and contrasted what happens when you adapt at different levels. Now, the second element in cultural adaptation is that you need to have a framework that guides that adaptation. We utilize the ecological validity framework by Bernal and colleagues that has 8 dimensions of adaptation. That means that you look at different dimensions such as language, the people delivering interventions, metaphors in the content, but also the context and the way in which you deliver that intervention. For the sake of time, I won't get into a lot of those dimensions. We have publications in which we have detailed how we have adapted according to those dimensions, and I'm very happy to share those with you. Now, NIMH funded us to answer these questions. What happens when you adapt at different levels? What you see here is the adapted version of Generation PMTO. Now remember, Generation PMTO originally developed with the majority of Euro-American populations, non-Latino. So it was a very initial adaptation for Latino populations. It's a very good adaptation that very thorough language. We put a lot of attention to expressions throughout the intervention. But if you see, we did not overtly address the ways in which culture, oppression, discrimination impacts parenting. On the second adapted intervention, which we will call a deep structure adaptation, we maintain all the core parenting components. As you can see here are the core components, which are essential to keep, and very happy to have a conversation about that in the Q&A. So we maintain the core components, but we also inserted culture and context specific sessions at the beginning and at the end. One session in which we would talk about what it's like to be a Latino immigrant parents and the challenges, and another session about culture. And throughout these sessions, we would purposefully address the ways in which parenting challenges were associated with experiences of discrimination. We were very purposeful about addressing that. And I can give examples in the Q&A as well. Now, what was the impact on that? So remember, this was the surface level adaptation, this was the deep structure adaptation. What we observe is that both groups compared to control, when we look at 6-month follow-up, benefited of parenting practices. All the parents in both groups benefited from parenting practices. But the data that was very important to see was that the child mental health outcomes, these are internalizing and externalizing symptomatology, really went down in a more significant way for the deep structure adaptation compared to the surface level adaptation. when we went to our qualitative studies to understand the experiences of parents, something very important happened. Parents said, now I finally understand how all the pain, all the adversity that I experience as an immigrant, I take it on the kids. I work 10 hours, they pay me 6, and I say, excuse me, I work 10 hours. And then the boss tells me, well, do you want me to call immigration or you or what? Because I have 20 people that want your job, which, by the way, the majority of these parents do not have contracts. They are hired on a daily basis. So this father would say, I get home and I feel so powerless, but guess what? I have power over my kids and I abuse that power. Very powerful insights in terms of understanding how discrimination is intertwined with daily experiences. And the same for mothers who were experiencing social isolation because they were dependent on the males who could get the jobs, experiencing depression, isolation. They would also talk about the ways in which I don't have anyone to process my anger and frustration, but I have the kids and I take it on the kids. So for these parents that you see here, the reports of their children improving on their depression, anxiety, but also aggressive behaviors, they provided several narratives in the way in which their understanding of how their parenting was impacted by oppression helped them enhance their parenting skills, but also become aware of the impact of oppression in their lives. Like this parent who expressed, I learned that I was the one who had to change rather than expected my child to change. This is huge for us. We never tell parents, don't do that. We tell parents, how do you manage that situation? Let's role play a different way of managing that situation. And by role plays and enacting situations is that we promote an insight with parents. And this is beautiful when parents arrive to this place like, oh, I was the problem rather than my kids. So we'll continue. Subsequent to this study, NIDA was very interested in us expanding our program of research to adapt the intervention for families, Latino immigrant families with adolescent children, and a focus on substance use prevention. The first study I mentioned to you, I described to you, were families with children ages 4 through 12. This is a study with families with adolescents ages 12 through 14. Now, in this study, it was a randomized trial, but we only had 2 conditions, the deep structure adaptation and control, because we already had confirmed the importance of overtly addressing discrimination and biculturalism. Now, the challenge of this study that it was launched at the at the outset of the Trump administration, so we were immediately impacted by massive deportations and very aggressive activities by ICE. So much that this is the type of data we collected. We had never collected this type of data in our clinical trials. My son was bullied by classmates at school because I'm an immigrant. It got to the point of him saying that he wanted to die. We suffer by being immigrants, where our children suffer even more. When we talk about this, my son tells me, Mom, I know you came here to offer us a better future. So you remember many of those videos in which children in schools were yelling, build a wall, build a wall. Well, we were in the midst of that, experiencing that, and the families we were delivering the intervention to were experiencing that. And then it was also very challenging. One Monday, you're delivering a parenting program with 24 parents, and then the next Monday, there are 2 seats empty. And you cannot hide the fact that those parents were arrested and deported by ICE. And the children were sent to social services. And regardless of that, we continuously work with families to touch base if they wanted to continue in the intervention. We didn't want them to be at risk. And that was a huge factor why we conducted our parenting programs in the basement of churches, because those are places that there's an unspoken agreement that are off limits to ICE. So we never experienced any direct interactions with ICE, but unfortunately our families were deeply impacted in the community by ICE activities. In addition to that level of oppression, also in our intervention, we talk about cultural conflicts. That is a direct response to the cultural adaptation according to Bernal's dimensions. Parents going one direction in terms of their cultural identity, whereas adolescents go in a different direction according to English language, US cultural norms. Our children have lived all their lives here, and we want to educate them like we were raised. We live in two cultures, and we need to find a way to keep both cultures as we raise our kids. So I would like to finish by saying and highlighting, we do a lot of international work. And I would like to finish by saying that it's very important that we own the privilege we have in this country. And by doing the trials with very generous resources, it's very important that we look at contexts in which those resources don't exist. This is the state of Chihuahua. I'm a native born here. And in Chihuahua, because of the war on cartels, we just cannot implement our RCTs. We cannot think in the way we think here about generating science. We cannot do RCTs because the cartels identify mobility in communities and we become a threat. Actually, a couple of times we tried to initiate trials, we received threats from the cartels. But what we have done is really move to mental health agencies and train extraordinary people in evidence-based interventions, and we culture adapt as we go with them, but from a service perspective. We have not generated a single publication from that work, just one in prevention science in which we indirectly talk about this, because we would put at risk our community leaders and organizations. Hopefully one day will change, not so much in northern Mexico in the foreseeable future. But I just want to highlight that all of these people have worked with victims of the cartel violence, and they're extraordinary in the work we do. And we only need to share what we have learned from our trials here. And finally, in Chile, we're developing a nationwide dissemination in which we have a multi-sectorial collaboration in which they are really utilizing the process of adaptation, the empirical evidence we have generated, and they are adopting that for the country of Chile. So just wanted to close this presentation by highlighting that it's so important to go to the international context, even if it's just consulting. But what we have learned here cannot stay here in the United States. There's so much to be done at the international level. And we'd like to finalize by thanking all the directors of these extraordinary programs, our co-presenters, and to all of you who are in the trenches making a difference. You are the hope. There's so much to be done, particularly for populations who continue to experience discrimination and oppression. And we have all our hope in you that you will carry that torch, and we honor the efforts that you continue to do every day to change this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruben. I think I would encourage you to go and look in the chat. I think it's safe to say that your talk, a lot of people found your talk very moving. With that, that was a focus on cultural adaptation. We are going to now move to the third presentation, and then after that, we will have Q&A with all of the panelists from this particular panel. And so I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kegelis, and I will be sharing her slides while she's talking. So if we have a flail with the slides, you can point the daggers this way, not towards her.
Ruben, I wanted to thank you for a very interesting and moving presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Deeply appreciate it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So I'm going to be talking about translating or adapting empowerment to international context, but starting with notes about domestic issues. And I want to acknowledge the great team that I've had in all of this work. Greg Rebchuk, who's not here today, he's worked on the adaptation of the overall adaptation wherever we go. Andres Mayorana has worked on the Lima part. Scott Tebbets has worked on the Beirut part. And then I want to acknowledge my other team members. Next slide. So the aim of my talk is to discuss the process through which empowerment has been adapted for international sites. I'm not going to be talking about implementation or the final version of the manual or intervention protocol post-implementation. I'm talking more about as we are getting ready to do the research, what that we were doing in each place, what were we doing to adapt it. And so I'm not also going to be talking much about the specific adaptations we made for Peru or Lebanon. Next slide. So the previous research is that we developed empowerment to target HIV prevention and testing among young gay, bis, same gender loving MSM, ages 18 to 29. It's a multi-level intervention working at individual, social, community, and structural levels. The original research we did was conducted in small college towns with mostly white MSM, and we thought that we were developing something that would work for all young MSM. And pretty soon off, we realized that no, we were pretty much adapting it for young white MSM, middle class, and we were missing the boat. So it's missing the boat about adapting it for young men of color. And so adaptation issues had to be addressed very soon after our original research because of the diversity among ethnic racial groups of young MSM living in diverse contexts in the US, and because community-based organizations right off wanted to start implementing it, but they also wanted to start adapting it right away. So we needed to start thinking about how we could work with them, how we could provide technical assistance and training and so forth to help them to make wise choices in adaptation. Next. I also have come at this from a cultural humility stance. I always try to consider carefully my intersecting identities and how these have shaped my lived experiences and worldviews, and how the intersecting identities and lived experience of young MSM vary considerably from my own. So unlike Ruben, who may have known a lot of these issues from the inside, I recognize that I don't. I've never been a young gay man. So I recognize the need to always collaborate with others who know the population. Next. So baked into the fabric of empowerment is community collaboration and community engagement. And this is done through one of the core elements, the core group. So empowerment is run by and for young MSM via the core group. And we developed a comprehensive manual incorporating considerable input from community-based organizations and health department staff. So we always have seen collaboration, community collaboration and engagement as critical. Next. Our early research then, we were also one of the interventions that the CDC supported throughout most of the epidemic. And so we started doing research on core elements and so forth early on. And so we identified the guiding principles that underlie the intervention. And the awareness of these enable operational variations. So a constant conceptualization of the separation of the desired processes we're trying to get going that lead to the changes and outcomes from how they're operationalized. They don't always have to be operationalized the exact same way. And the guiding principles are incorporated into every core element of the intervention and used to guide adaptations. So exactly how the core elements are implemented differs from location to location, as long as they address the processes and the guiding principles. Next slide. So here are the guiding principles. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll talk about a few. So empowerment, the project, as I said, is run by and for young MSM. They think out many of the parts of the intervention, not the basic core structure, but how it's all implemented, they think out. And they take on the messages about HIV prevention themselves. It's also based on peer influence, that peers are most likely to influence other peers. And so we mobilize peers to support and talk with their friends. And then the project has always been sex positive. We've never used shame. We never talk about don't do that. It's always been a very positive approach, recognizing that sex is wonderful, it's fun, it can be loving. And we always talk about sex in a positive way and focusing on pride in who you are. Next slide. These are the core elements. There are a number of core elements. It is a big and pretty complicated intervention, but they all relate to each other. So there's the core group, as I've said, it takes place in a project space. as well as going out in the community. There's formal outreach that goes out into the community and spreads the messages. And we have outreach events, social events that bring people to the project. Informal outreach involves young men talking with their peers and supporting their peers around HIV prevention. There's an ongoing publicity about the project. And there's M groups, which is the most formulaic approach that we have, where we do lay out how to do this. And these are one-time 3-hour groups, the way we've done them in the US, that touch upon many specific issues about HIV prevention, as well as how to do informal outreach. Next. So we also developed key characteristic of each core element. And these concretely describe how the guiding principles are incorporated into core elements. So for example, here are some of the key characteristics of the core group. The core group is empowered to make decisions. They're encouraged to analyze problems in their community and how activities that they will implement will address those problems. It needs to be large enough group to do the work. They're comprised of men representing different segments of the young men's community. And the core group has to be fun and social at least some of the time in order to keep core group members attending. They don't usually come to something just because it's about HIV prevention. They come because they want to meet other young gay men and have fun. Next slide. So we start with, when we're thinking about how to adapt it, that we review or conduct ethnographic research on young MSM. And there's a host of questions that we ask. And if it's already been published before, done before, that's great. Otherwise, we do it ourselves. And we always include experts who know about these issues. So as just some of the examples, where does the HIV risk come from? Boyfriend, casual partners, what are their ages? What are attitudes towards HIV testing? How much HIV testing is done among young men? We definitely talk about the nature of stigma. It's ever present. And how is it manifested? How does it affect young men? So we'll talk about HIV stigma. We'll learn about how stigma is aimed at young MSM, gay bi men, and racial ethnic group membership. And we also try to learn about the internalization of these kinds of stigma, how they experience it outwards, and how the interaction between what you experience outwards and what you internalize. Next. And then these are examples of more questions that we need to know about. Where do men socialize together? Where and how? Are there bars, clubs, public sex environments? How out are young men in this community, in this culture? What are different segments of men in the community? Is there a cohesive community? How do young MSM trust? Do they trust each other? Do they not trust anyone? How do they communicate with each other? And the degree of comfort discussing sex. So these are all issues we try to learn about as we're getting ready to start doing adaptation. Next. So going to Peru, the foci of the adaptation there was working with Peruvian working class and lower income MSM. And I forgot to say it's also about 18 to 35, I believe. We also were working with, or we're just ending the project now, with transgender women together with gay men. And both between the two of them, they had to have the majority of HIV in Peru. And we also included in this adaptation concepts from Rafael Diaz's work, qualitative research and intervention for immigrant Latino MSM to the US, such as machismo, familismo, and so forth. And then we've heavily relied on our collaboration with our Peruvian colleagues. Our US team has worked with our Peruvian colleagues on, we began with a multi-site international study in which MSM were one group. And then we went on to conduct a small qualitative study of transgender women in 3 cities from a CAPS Innovative grant. And then we obtained and conducted an R34 grant. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. And then it followed by an R01. So we took this, it was a fairly lengthy process of moving into full intervention. So analysis of the guiding principles and core elements takes a substantial amount of time. An earlier presenter, perhaps Laura, I'm not sure, was talking about how it takes time. You need a slow and thorough analysis. You really need time to reflect. You can't do this in a rushed method. It took many days and many weeks and many months over time. And all of our work to initially start thinking about the adaptations was done in person with our whole team together. And we always had a very diverse team with a long history of working together. So it was a combined US Argentinian, Peruvians, and US Peruvian people on the project. We had gay men, a straight man, and straight women on the team. We had a community social psychologist, that's me, ethnographers, epidemiologists, and 2 physician social researchers. So quite a combination team of experts from different points of view and different expertise. Next. So we ask of this as we're going through the analysis of guiding principles, and we essentially tear each principle apart, discuss it thoroughly, and then rebuild it in the adapted form. So we start with, what do we mean by this construct, this guiding principle? Is it relevant here? Does it make sense? Are there barriers and facilitators to this? Are there caveats to following this guiding principle in Peru? What does the ethnographic research say about this? And does this vary? Do these findings vary between MSM and transgender women? And how can each guiding principle be applied to helping MSM and transgender women work together? Next. To go on, then we also went through the core elements one by one, having reviewed all the guiding principles. I won't go through each of these, but we ask things like, what are the goals of this core element? What are the variations we've seen before? Because by the time we were doing this research in Peru, my team and I had already worked with something like 200 organizations in the US that were trying to do adaptations, and many were Latino adaptations. So what are the concerns that they might have about the core elements? Does it make any sense, the core elements? We really wanted to go back to the start. Does this core element even make sense here? Have you done it before? Has anyone done it before? And how did it work? Really exploring the guiding principles incorporated into the core element. Do they make sense? Should each core element be conducted together or separately for MSM and trans women? And then for some areas, especially as we are adapting Raphael's ideas, we had to consider how to develop new exercises, and even the old exercises, such as role plays, for example, or musical chairs. We always use a lot of gamification approaches. I didn't know that was a term until recently, but we've been doing it forever. We always make the activities fun and engaging and interactive. And these sometimes had to be completely revamped from the US to Peru. Next. We then, after we had developed our core elements and the guiding principles, then we conducted focus groups, we especially focused on the M group exercises. And we would do a focus group with 1 to 3 exercises with real MSM and trans women, not our team. And we would try it out, and then we would stop and say, well, what did you think? How did you experience that? What do you think we were trying to address? And then after we had gone through that with all of the exercises, we put them all together and piloted it in total. And with MSM for one M group and for trans women in a separate group. And we realized that they needed to become 4 sessions instead of 1 long session in the US, as we do in the US. And then with our R34, we piloted the entire intervention for 9 months in Callao, an area near Lima. And then after that, we were able to revise it But in the interim, sort of the HIV world had changed quite a bit, and we realized that we now wanted to not only address prevention and testing, but we wanted to move into addressing the entire continuum of prevention and care. So it was a major revamping from that, but thankfully we weren't required to go back to another R34. Next. So these are just a smattering of findings and adaptation. So the core group involved both MSM and trans women, and they talked extensively about stigma from other people, internalized stigma, and how to work together, realizing that they had a lot more in common than they had realized before, and they could really work together. We learned that masculinity is very privileged, whether it's masculine MSM or men who have sex with transgender women, and that the more femme men tended not to be proud of themselves very much. And it's important to recognize that these are not related to being tops or bottoms. And we realized that we needed to consider masculinity issues in all of the core elements. We learned that government provided condoms were seen as defective and that lube is very expensive. So we had to consider that. We found that life is pretty boring in these communities. They pretty much just watch TV and there's not much else going on, and they're looking for things to do. So social activities, including the core group involvement, is a draw. And they're willing to come to multiple sessions of M groups. But we also needed to accommodate many trans women who are sex workers, and we had to take into account their work schedules. They work in the evenings. We found that talking about sex with friends is challenging and counter-normative, and this goes into sexual silence that Raphael talked about. So they need lots of practice to be able to talk about sex with each other. And trans women were not interested in tending because of attraction to each other. They weren't coming to look for other trans women to be partners with, but they were attracted to the project because they have common interests such as cooking, human rights, how to deal with police. So we still found ways to attract them to the project. Next slide. Okay, so now let's go to an entirely different continent. And this is in Beirut, Lebanon. This project was conducted with a diverse team as well, we only had a short time of working together, the time of an R01. And it was a combined US Lebanese team. It also had gay men, lesbian women, a straight woman on the team. And in terms of background, community social psychologist, a clinical psychologist, a sociologist, qualitative research, a master's level qualitative researcher, 2 human rights, health, or social activists, one who was gay and one who was lesbian. There was no team building done on the project. I wasn't PI. And the trust and rapport was not really established very well for genuine conversations about adaptation issues and brainstorming together. It was a 5-year R01, and it was posited as a large pilot study. And we were able to do a limited amount of qualitative research at the very start of the project. Next slide. So let's think about the context of Beirut and Lebanon. So there was a prior civil war that had ended in 1990, but it still had an impact in which it was a multifaceted armed conflict that took place for 15 years, and it resulted in many deaths and an exodus of 1 million people. Beirut is the most liberal city in the Middle East, especially before the Civil War, but still currently. There'd been no MSM intervention conducted before that we knew of. And there were lots of refugees in Lebanon from Palestine from years earlier and from Syria currently during the project, which increased the country's population by 50%, huge. And there were many illegal refugees. People could simply walk over the mountains and come over to Lebanon from Syria. There were only a few gay rights organizations, and we partnered with one of them. There's tremendous police harassment ever present, and especially, but not solely, about illegal Syrians. So if they're stopped, and there's lots of traffic stops all the time, and if they are carrying a condom, carrying anything suggesting gay, anything on their cell phones, they're required to open their cell phones and show police what's on their cell phones, and they are then at risk of being thrown out of the country or worse. Next. So what did we focus on for the adaptation? Well, we were focusing on young MSM, again, 18 to 29, who live in the Beirut area. They're very diverse in terms of religion. They're raised Christian or Muslim. Most of the guys were no longer considered themselves Christian or Muslim, and we always heard about how the gay community didn't care about that. I still think that was questionable if they didn't care about that. There were diversity in terms of nationality, because there were refugees from all sorts of other countries, such as Iraq. Diversity in terms of their legal status, their economic status. Many of the refugees were very, very poor. And whether they wanted to stay in Lebanon or were leaving Lebanon. We constantly heard people saying that they were trying to get out of Lebanon. And there's diversity in terms of fear of the police. I mean, everyone's afraid of them, but the middle-class Lebanese men were not so fearful, but the refugees were very fearful, and nearly all were very worried about confidentiality. And there was enormous pressure on appearance. It sometimes reminded me more of Los Angeles than of a Middle Eastern country, about how you looked, clothing, hair, beards, what kind of car you drove, and so forth. Next slide. Next slide.
Sorry to interrupt, Susan, just to let you know that we are getting about to time here, a little bit over, as a matter of fact. So yeah, we just want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. So thank you so much. This is all.
I'm almost done. So we reviewed the manual. We had weekly 2-hour meetings for several months to review it. There was some degree of disagreement and distrust among the team. One person, for example, talking about pride and said, what's to be proud of just because you're gay? You're just born that way. Where's the pride about? And then we revised the manual afterwards. Next. We did a 3-day retreat where we worked with community members, reviewed everything, talked about everything. We revised it. We then piloted it with gay men, and then we revised the intervention protocol again. Go ahead. We implemented most of the core elements, but they lacked many of the key characteristics. And although I had been optimistic that we could find ways around it, such as how to do publicity, we had a very difficult time doing it. And things like the space was poorly utilized. The core group did not represent diverse segments of the community, and so forth. So it was really difficult to implement the core elements as we had desired. Next. So Lebanon and the project. The processes we were trying to engage just didn't happen very well. 6 months after the end of the project, there was a huge explosion, many of you might have heard of, in which many people in Beirut died, and Lebanon has been falling apart. Nearly everyone we worked with there has left the country, as well as many of the young MSM have left. And we have not gone on to do more research in the Middle East and North Africa about MSM. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That is an informative talk, and thanks to all of our panelists for what was a very informative panel. We will be taking questions in the chat or by raising hand, just like we did the last time. Sherry will be monitoring that. But I just want to start this. Each of you in your own ways sort of touched on this. It came up in sort of different ways. And that is basically this tension between thoroughness and speed in some cases, or just inability to be thorough in some way. It can be that you're pressed for time, like happened with digital interventions around the rollout of COVID, where suddenly you had to make everything online. It can be the kind of research program gets thrown askew by world events in the case of Ruben's talks, or what Ruben's research, and Susan, what you were just talking about there. And so how do you balance that? Like, is there an intervention light that makes sense in a certain situation, or is there just a situation where you have to say adaptation is just not going to work in this context? And I open that up to all three of the panelists.
Well, let me just start. And, I think, we all sort of had this experience, certainly during COVID, where we had to sort of turn on a dime in terms of thinking about not only sort of adapting our interventions to sort of fit the new reality of some of the restrictions, but then we really had to adapt a lot of the processes, right? So it wasn't just intervention, but it was sort of like really trying to figure out how to do, for example, remote DBS or dried blood spot collection or remote HIV testing. And so I think that really presented some huge challenges. So like an example of changing processes with transgender youth and gender diverse youth, we really had to now do safety checks with them before we could sort of either run our session or send them home kits for data collection to make sure that they were comfortable receiving those, since a lot of that those processes were taking place in the clinic prior to COVID. But in terms of adapting sort of a light intervention, again, I think it sort of almost goes back to sort of principles that a lot of us were talking about today, which is the idea of sort of like, what are the core components? And maybe if that hasn't already been done, where you sort of front load those core components at the beginning of your interactions with participants. So we had an e-coaching intervention where we basically had to make it really clear that, these were the 4 e-coaching sessions we really wanted participants to get. So we front loaded those. Luckily, we already had that done before COVID, but if you hadn't done that before COVID, you probably want to sort of think about rearranging those. And then there were just some things about like, are there ways that you can take some of those core pieces of the intervention that you might be delivering over Zoom or sort of in more resource intensive ways, and quickly sort of turn them into, for example, other digital formats like text messaging, which tends to be a little easier to kind of quickly develop and implement. But in the end, sometimes, and I think NIH had these mechanisms where you could ask for more time and money, right? To try to sort of really effectively adapt some of those components so that you could really maintain some of those key pieces to it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and this is where this conversation about the balance between fidelity and cultural relevance is so important. And I think for us, we know very well in terms of parenting what are the mechanisms of change we're tracking and what are the core components. And that's the beauty of collaborating across the world, because several of our colleagues are arriving at the same conclusions in terms of mechanisms of change and core components in different populations, ethnic, racial backgrounds. So there's a meta theory on parenting and mechanisms of change with parenting that we know works. And some of the trials, for example, in Norway by our colleagues in Norway with the same intervention with refugee populations that caught the core components, they realized that in follow-up, they lose the intervention impact. Families go back to punitive parenting, for example. So I think for us, we have moved now into Zoom-based interventions, like so many of us have, because we were forced. That was the first major step, including me. Many of us, we were like, no, Zoom-based, in-person, do the personal thing. And COVID said, sorry, you cannot do that. So we learned that Zoom-based are working really well. Actually, our retention rates have gone up, and retention rates of fathers and engagement have gone up. But yesterday, there was a beautiful presentation by Willie Prado at University of Miami, in which they are integrating Zoom-based, in-person, soap opera type of asynchronous type of materials and virtual delivery of some components. And I really think that's the future, because they have reduced a lot the in-person Zoom-based delivery, but they have not given up the core components, but they have replaced those with other type of formats that work. For example, with Latino soap operas works really well, and families are very happy with those, but also some virtual interventionists. So I really think we're moving into the realm of hybrid interventions in a way that if we realize, according to our theory, that we cannot compromise the core components, that's a whole avenue that we have in the future for us.
Yeah. I have lots of mixed thoughts about it, so I'm trying to narrow it down to one thing. I think going in a light way, we've considered quite a bit in lots of different settings, but the problem is you still need to have these action, these activities, the mechanisms going on. And so we haven't been able to figure out how to do that in a lighter way, at least in international context, or for that matter, in the US. I mean, that was one of the problems we had in Peru, for example. Publicity was really important so that you reach different communities, since it's a community-wide approach. And we couldn't do it. I guess you could say we tried it in a lighter way because we weren't able to do it other than very limited stuff. And the news just didn't get out about this intervention throughout the community. So it's difficult. You really have to think about, are you being able to achieve the processes you're trying to achieve if you go in a light form?
So there's a similar or a related question in the chat from Jenny Kang, who asks, do the panelists have insights on experiencing in balancing scale-up projects for greater reach across populations versus the rigorous adaptation? And I would say that the scale up might be potentially a lighter approach, so similar to what you've been talking about, but insights on balancing this sort of scale up for more folks versus rigorous adaptation.
One reason that we had to get into rigorous evaluations with some of our work domestically is because community-based organizations would say, well, you showed that it worked with so-and-so, but you haven't showed that it worked with my population, so I don't trust it. And so we had to go towards a little bit more rigorous approaches to be able to get it so that it was trustworthy in the country. But then we also worked with, the organizations that moved towards implementing it in the US. And in that way, we were able to see a lot of ways that they might it was being scaled up, but they weren't involving rigorous evaluations. It was more focusing on, are you doing the key characteristics? Are you achieving that? And in ways of thinking about fidelity.
Not sure if Keith or Ruben wanted to respond to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of makes me think of a few things. One, it makes me think of these like light applications that NIH sort of has been funding, or NIAID has been funding, and the new one is D-Light, where you can sort of add intervention components to it. But so I think there's interest in sort of this idea of reach, right? Sort of like, how can we sort of reach a huge number of people with interventions that tend to be on the lighter side, right? Because you're sort of trying to sort of serve many people. But one of the things I was thinking about too was, I think, and I fully agree with Ruben, that I think hybrid interventions are something that we need to sort of really be focusing on. But I also think of different designs like stepped care approaches, where we sort of give people sort of a light form of the intervention. And then for those people who really aren't responding, then we sort of intensify the amount of intervention, or think about sort of smart trial designs where we can take sort of interventions that have a good amount of evidence base, but really then start to tailor them and sort of ramp up resources for those people who really need it, so that we can sort of scale it up more broadly, but we can really focus on more resources on the people who need a more intensive intervention.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think our State group in their parenting work by our dear friend late now, Deshaun and others have shown these scaling up approaches to parenting. I think in the specific realm of parenting, the challenge is that if there's a background of abuse experienced by parents, when you come and present components that are about nurturing and emotional involvement, it triggers the trauma and loss in parents, and that's where things get complicated. That's why going light, it's been difficult, because how do you keep assessing that? Because those issues of trauma, they come until later in the intervention. So that's a great research question, how we can move in the direction that he's expressing. while also being able to identify trauma, because it's very hard to identify it in the baseline. It really comes as a process of trust by parents. And in terms of the scaling up, I think Chile is a wonderful experience for us, because after conducting these very rigorous randomized controlled trials here in adaptation, our process has been more about tailoring in the international context. So we always conduct pilot studies to really examine in depth the different dimensions of adaptation in each of the components, and following those pilot studies with 40, 50 families. Right now, we just completed a trial with 500 families, and the satisfaction was very high and the adherence was very high, but it was a lot about the tailoring of the intervention, but not the full-blown adaptation process, because that tailoring process was informed by previous very rigorous adaptation processes.
And I know we are nearing the top of the hour here. So I want to ask a question. Well, I'm going to ask you all a question, but I want to also just flag that Rochelle may have to launch. We will have some sort of survey for feedback. And Rochelle, I don't know if we're doing that through Zoom. If so, that poll will probably launch here momentarily.
No, sorry, it'll come by email.
It's
So
going to
no
come by email,
interruption.
great. So no interruption, terrific. So let me ask then send a cold shudder up everyone's spine kind of question as the last thing, which is about funding, right? And this balance in the review committees between sometimes they want it to be just aim one of a multi-aim grant is your adaptation. Sometimes they want it to be an R34. Sometimes they want it to be, I don't know, a whole R01. There's a million ways you can sort of fail at the review committee. So what advice would you have? I mean, we certainly have a lot of junior investigators here who are starting out, who also have the World of K awards that they're considering. What advice would you have in terms of what's a good strategy? Recognizing none is ever going to be a guaranteed perfect strategy with NIH.
I think in our experience, I can tell you, we have been blessed by having extraordinary program officers in NIMH and NIDA. Very, very honest conversations with them in terms of saying we work with undocumented families with mixed immigration status, citizen children, and unknown or undocumented status with the parents. But we have this health disparity issue, and they have been stellar at helping us frame those challenges from a scientific perspective, so it can go through the review panel and also through the institute. So you know, we don't have access to insurance, but we have access to addressing a scientific question, and they have been tremendous advocates for us in that. So I'm extremely grateful to our funding agencies in that regard. So I think those very honest conversations in terms of saying, see, this is the population and this is the dilemma that we're facing. As long as you speak to the mission and vision of the Institute, it's been a really wonderful experience. And an example of that is that they told us not to go to the implementation science review panel. They told us to go to health disparities, because our side was the end of one church, and it was not going to resonate with reviewers. And that type of guidance has also been important and essential.
Great.
I found it enormously helpful to start with an R34 because you have, especially if it's very innovative, you're not knocking your head against reviewers who want a huge amount of data to show that you should do an R01. And you really learn a lot in an R34. You really find out where the potholes are. And so I would recommend it, albeit I know that it's much less funding and not all the institutes support it.
I fully agree. I fully agree.
Keith, I know you're on review. Oh, there you go.
Oh yeah. No, I just rotated up a review session or a section, and I'll just say that I usually begin with an R34, but I have one grant where we took 2 interventions that had at least some preliminary evidence and one with pretty good evidence from a larger efficacy RCT, and we combined those 2 interventions for a digital intervention, and we got funded for that. So I think that review committees typically tend to be skeptical of R01s that are proposing pilot work and then moving on to an efficacy trial for that reason. But it's not unheard of, it's just much more difficult.
I would only add, within the R34s, we've been funded of 2 build a pilot study. We have always built a pilot study year one with 30 families to really go in depth with cultural adaptation. And then the RCT comes in the following 2 years. So even though the R34 is about pilot, build a pilot within the pilot so the reviewers can see the rigor. And we've been very lucky to be funded on first review because they saw the sequence and the methodological rigor of that logic.
Great.
And also I put on the chat, somebody had a question about a resource on cultural adaptation. I put the reference for Guillermo Bernal's book on cultural adaptation, where he integrates and discusses several cultural adaptation frameworks.
Great.
Ruben, someone also had a question in the chat about whether some of the outcomes that you saw. So I don't know if you have time to take a quick check of that, but I think we have to close the session.
Yes.
So I just want to say that, I can't thank the panelists enough for bringing these rigorous models of adaptation and these amazing and inspired examples of adapted interventions from so many different perspectives and lived experiences. Thank you so much for joining us. We will have this, Rochelle has posted a few times in the chat where we'll be able to find the recordings in the future once we've gotten them uploaded. I just want to thank you all again. This has really been such a tour de force. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thank you
so much. Appreciate it.
Really amazing.
Thank you all.